So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off and then hand it over to Naomi. My name is Amelia Bono. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the co-founder and executive director of Shout Your Abortion. We are a nationwide organization that's working to normalize abortion and elevate safe paths to access regardless of legality. We make resources, campaigns, and media intended to arm existing activists, create new ones, and foster collective participation in abortion access all over the country. Thank you for being here tonight for, I believe, our 7th installment of Abortion Academy. Each one of these monthly webinars are presented by one of our exceptionally brilliant colleagues whose work we want to introduce to our larger SYA community. And we hope that Abortion Academy will deepen your knowledge, propel your curiosity, help you connect some of the dots between the issues that you're navigating regionally and what's happening at the national and even international level, and ultimately to give you fresh ideas to take back into your community. Audience members will be off camera and muted for security reasons, but we will have a format for you to ask questions throughout the presentation, which the question, you can put a question in the chat at any time and we'll get to it afterwards. Naomi is going to speak for 30 to 40 minutes and then Naomi and I will start chatting and hopefully you'll start asking questions and we'll all have a convo. So today we will be hearing from Naomi Braine, a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, CUNY. Prior to joining the faculty at Brooklyn, she worked in the nonprofit research sector on issues of drug use and HIV and consulted for community-based organizations. Her political and intellectual work addresses gender, sexuality, reproductive justice, wars on drugs and terror, and health and collective action. Her current work as an activist and a research investigator is centered on self-managed abortion, and it is this incredible book in my hands, Abortion Beyond the Law. We are so excited to have Naomi here today. We're so glad that Naomi wrote this book and spoke to all of these brilliant people about the work that they are doing to get abortion pills into the hands of people that need them all over the world in contexts that are in some ways very different than the one here in the US and in some ways the same. And it's obviously a very timely topic. Yeah, and I to me, like, SYA is so interested in looking outside of US models. We wish that the US movement did more of that. We are ourselves so motivated by our friends all around the world and who are participating in this global movement to claim abortion access as belonging to the people currently and indefinitely, regardless of what any courts have to say about it. And, you know, you'll be hearing a ton about laws and pills, and especially around this SCOTUS Miffy case that is looming over all of us. And this book is a great reminder that the law is not a description of what is possible. It is not a description of what is moral. It is a suggestion that is being made by a bunch of assholes, and it is as effective as we are collectively compliant. So with that, I will hand it over to the very capable actual professor, Naomi Braine.
All right, thank you, Amelia. I mean, laws are, I like the framing of laws are a suggestion. In my occasional, activist trainer hat, I say, that yes, we comply or we don't. That government counts on our compliance. All right, so let me put on a share screen. So I have abortion beyond the law and safe outside the system. A lot of how I got into this, my bio says, harm worked on drug use and HIV and whatnot. So I was a harm reduction activist. I'm starting in the early 90s, which dates me in all kinds of ways. So I was involved in early needle exchange programs in both Chicago, primarily in Chicago, but also in New York. And I eventually moved into doing research on harm reduction and drug use in HIV. But I moved into it from having handed out needles on street corners. So if we fast forward to 2015, I think it was, somebody who some of you may know or have heard of, Lynn Paltrow, who is the person who founded the organization that is now Pregnancy Justice. Lynn Paltrow was one of the most visible voices within harm reduction around reproductive justice. And she had she had friends like me and a few others who were also sharing that discourse. So she had a meeting in 2015, which in many ways is the start of this project that produced this book, and that is why I'm now talking to you. Lynn pulled together for an entire day a small number of reproductive justice activists, mostly Latinas, and a group of, there were 3 of us who had been involved in the very early days of needle exchange. And she put us in a room together, she fed us, and she wanted us to talk about what it meant to work outside the system. And in particular, she wanted to teach the needle exchange people about medication abortion, and she wanted us to talk about what it meant to work in a context of, at best, questionable legality, and in some cases, outright transparent illegality, and what that was like, and what we could learn, how we could share information about that. And what I brought into that room with Tim and Trish and my other needle exchange colleagues was a conviction that legality doesn't make you safe, that illegality doesn't make you unsafe, that we make each other safe, we keep each other safe, we help each other stay safe. And that was the core of needle exchange, was that if people need some information and they need some tools, and that if you give them information and tools, they will figure out how to use it. And you can work with them and support them as they figure out the best way for them to use it in their situation. So, so when I heard about medication abortion, I was like, fuck yeah, this totally makes sense to me. Whereupon I was introduced to, in 2016 and 2017, I began to learn about and make connections, mostly in Latin America and with Women Help Women. If somebody wants to put a link to Women Help Women into the chat, that would be cool. And you could pull up their website. They are an amazing telehealth, and that ships pills all over the world other than the United States. And that's a whole other story. And they do a lot of work on the ground with frontline activists across Latin America, Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So I began making some friends on my own in Argentina and Chile, and I also began making some friends with Women Help Women. And those 2 kind of pathways came together with a lot of conversations about what would be useful and what was an appropriate role for me as a gringa from the north who was landing in the middle of this stuff that was solidly in progress. How could I be useful? And so that ended up taking me to a focus on the transnational nature of it, that is visible from half a step outside, even more so than from deeply inside, that an ethnography of a particular collective was not mine to do. But talking to people about networks and how they knew each other and how they did their work and how they shared their work and how they got into it, and kind of a bigger picture rather than something that drilled down deeply in one location. A bigger picture and a little bit more surfacey was something that I could usefully do. And so that's what I did, with help from really a core group of amazing people who introduced me to folks, and and who vouched for me and who said, yeah, you should talk to her, even before they really knew me. kind of on that trust thing of like, I know so and so, and we know certain people together. So these pics here are of places that I did research, including the United States, not gay as in happy, but queer as in fuck SCOTUS. That comes from the Dyke March, the New York City Dyke March, 24 hours after Dobbs dropped. And New York was alive with rage. So I was also but my primary research was with Women Help Women. I was also in Chile. I spent a lot of time in Chile, which is actually both of the Spanish photos. The Abortar Patriarcado y el Capital was from an abortion march in Santiago. And there was some graffiti in honor of that march that went up. I think that's on a statue that was outside the Universidad de Chile. In addition to Latin America, I went to Nigeria and Kenya. And the garden in the upper left is connected to the Kenyan NGO. So they taught me, and I learned from them, and I listened to them, and I hung out with them, and I feel incredibly privileged that they opened, their hearts, their organizations, their thoughts, and so on, to me and with me, and engaged in a lot of conversation. Some of it with a tape recorder running or a digital thing running, and a lot of it in parks and coffee shops and bars and various places where you have conversations that don't get recorded. So let me offer a brief history of this movement. And it is a transnational movement. Part of my ability to talk to people was that if I talked to folks in Chile, they could connect me to people in Ecuador and Mexico and Argentina, and folks in Kenya and Nigeria not only knew each other and Women Help Women, but they had been to an international meeting of hotlines. Two of them actually that happened in 2016 and 2018. So they knew some of the Latin American women that I had met with, right? So they know each other, they're talking to each other. So how did this start? Right, we have mifepristone and misoprostol, and we're used to them as a matched set. Medication abortion began in the 1980s in Brazil, where there was a ulcer medication down below, that was known as Cytotec then. We know it as misoprostol. And it came with this charming warning on it that said, do not take if you are pregnant, and do not become pregnant while taking this medicine because it can cause a miscarriage or other serious complications. And the short version appears to be that there were women in Brazil who read that label and thought, a miscarriage would be a really lovely thing right at this moment. And working with pharmacists who helped provide some information, women in Brazil became so good at using misoprostol and so good at teaching each other about it. And in the 1980s, there are no cell phones. There is no internet. There is at best old-fashioned landlines. There are people having conversations in old school fashion. And they shared information so effectively through feminist networks, but also through friendship networks and school-based networks, and who the hell knows what kind of networks, that what they were doing became visible to the Brazilian government, because some epidemiologists noted in their statistics that the maternal mortality rate from botched abortion had dropped. So this was how effective it was without any formal organization of any kind. And the word spread into Chile and kind of around Latin America. and Cytotec was available often directly in the pharmacies. Now, once the Brazilian epidemiologists said, hey, people are using this in this way, and apparently quite a lot of them are, it became less available in pharmacists, because that wasn't, the goal was not to preserve maternal health. The goal was to control women's bodies. And so when women took control of their own bodies in a way that involved using some medication they bought at a pharmacy, that medication was pulled out of the pharmacy. Nobody was arrested that anybody knows. So that's the beginning of SMA. The other thing that's happening across an ocean is that the French invented mifepristone and began doing medication abortion through the medical system that's gradually spread through Europe and was eventually approved in the United States in 2000. To move this history forward, we have the French, we have the Brazilians. The other thing that happens in the early 2000s, besides the US authorizing mifepristone in an unbelievably limited fashion, is that a boat, and the abortion boat, is launched out of, I forget whether it was Amsterdam or Rotterdam, but at any rate, the Dutch take a Dutch doctor and her staff take some first steps that take us towards telehealth and telemedicine. It began with the abortion boat, Women on Waves, who quickly became Women on Web, and began teaching people how to use abortion medication and sending it to them by mail. So these different threads kind of what was happening informally in Latin America and what began to happen in a kind of formal, organized way in Europe, including with this invention of international telehealth, that came together in 2008 in Ecuador, when the staff of Women on Web trained a collective of young feminists in Ecuador on how to teach people how to use both mifepristone and misoprostol, both together and misoprostol alone. And they launched a hotline that is still in existence today. And some of the people who helped launch it are still working on it today, but most of them have moved on. So hotlines kind of came out of this, and hotlines are probably the most basic form of outreach, the most basic form of support for SMA. So Aborto con Medicamentos is the logo, the image associated with Salud Mujeres in Ecuador, which is was the first hotline. And the basis for the hotline is the legal right to give and receive information, that sharing information is legal. Sharing pills is more complicated, but sharing information is legal. And any of you who have been through a training on SMA probably had hammered into your head that you have to share information and not give advice, right? And that's true in Latin America as much as it is here in the United States. So you cannot say, you could take this medication. You could say, this medication has this effects. People take this medication. The WHO protocol is. And as long as you hang with that, you should be within solid legal ground. And this has been, there are women all over the world. As we speak, there are probably more than half a dozen activists having conversations somewhere in the world with somebody who needs information on how to have a medication abortion. And the hotline spread like wildfire through Latin America, Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Misoprostol below is a web page. It's a Facebook. It's a Facebook identity. where she is Miss Oprostal. I believe it's based in Mexico. That's certainly where it started. So one of the, around the time that hotlines were emerging, activists in Mexico were, activists in Mexico were beginning to do what they called accompaniment. And the difference between a hotline and accompaniment is really just how much support you give somebody and whether you're committed to being in touch with them throughout the process. There are people who do a lot of accompaniment happens by telephone and by text message. So it's not like there's telephones and then there's something else. That a hotline is just, you can call anytime it's in operation, and whoever is answering the hotline will give you the information you need. Accompaniment is more a system where there's some education done, and then a particular activist makes a commitment to be available to a particular person as they go through an abortion. That's the difference between hotlines and accompaniment. And that what really happens through this is that we get transnational, globalized, demedicalized abortion. None of these people with hotlines or accompaniment, none of them are doing that because they are doctors. There may be some medical practitioners occasionally involved, but people have been trained by other activists, and that is the basis on which they are working. They are not working on it because they have a medical degree, right? And here we have more. So this is a list, an incomplete list of countries where there are safe abortion hotlines. Just to give you a sense, I think there are 25 or 30 around the world. So this is just over half. Maybe, I haven't counted it lately. And up on the screen, you get to see some of the logos, right? So Lesbianas y Feministas is or was the Argentinian hotline. Auntie Jane is one of the sub-Saharan African hotlines. Linea Aborto Chile was the second hotline to open. Actually, it's sort of unclear. Linea Aborto Chile and Lesbianas y Feministas in Argentina were the second and third. There's some debate as to who was second and who was third after Ecuador. They were trained by Ecuador. And in the lower right, we have the Polish hotline. And the basic structure globally is that this work is either done by collectives or by NGOs, also known as nonprofits. So, the collectives are lower to the ground. They are more flexible. They are harder to target. And there are more collectives in Latin America, right? Most of the movement in Latin America is not in NGOs. It is in collectives. The hotlines and the accompaniment groups are collectives. Mexico is the only Latin American country that I know of that has NGOs that do this work. And Fondo Maria is one of them, and they are also connected with some of the abortion funds here in the United States. Las Socorristas is, Las Socorristas rock the house. They're an accompaniment collective in Argentina. They are amazing and badass, and they they are, even in Latin America, there's a certain amount of like, yeah, okay, there's the Socorristas. They're extraordinary. And part of their extraordinariness is, the depth at which they take this on and support women throughout Argentina, and women and others who can become pregnant throughout Argentina. They have a trans analysis. They call themselves feminists and trans feminists. They will work with people in the second trimester. They are probably the experts on second trimester outside the system. And they are safe outside the system in the second trimester. And so so are some other Latin American collectives. And so is, I think it's Miss Rosie actually does more second try than Auntie Jane in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a network in sub-Saharan Africa called the Mama Network, which is a network of hotlines. So they're also, Mama Network, by the way, is a really good source for English language resources like manuals and things like that. So reach out. You don't have to invent the wheel. See what somebody else has done. You certainly don't have to invent the manual, for God's sake. There are so many abortion manuals out there, I really can't even tell you. And they are in multiple languages. If you want one you can get them through Latin America, you can get them in Spanish, Haitian Creole, and one of the indigenous languages, the Mapuche indigenous language, Mapudungun, I think it's called. So they got you covered on all of that. So let me talk a little bit about strategies, models. What are people doing? So a hotline provides information by phone. It can be done in any way from burner phones to a 24-hour, very complicated voice response system. Now, before you make any assumptions about technology and region, let me tell you that the burner phones are in Latin America, in the capitals of, South America, including relatively European cities like Buenos Aires and Santiago. And the 24-hour voice response systems are in the NGOs in Africa, where they have the unbelievable technology. I was blown away by the tech they're running there. So accompaniment is an ongoing connection by text, email, phone, or in person, from the initial providing information through the completion of the process and a little aftercare if needed. Accompaniment, most of it is by text, email, or phone. Most accompaniment collectives prioritize young people, teenagers, really vulnerable folks, and second trimester cases for in-person accompaniment. And that's partly because you can do a lot more by text, email, and phone than you can if you're with somebody in person. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also in the United States, there are community health workers of all different kinds, health educators, doulas, midwives, community resource workers who offer education and support. And they fold in, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, the community resource workers and health educators were folding in SMA along with birth control, along with, how do you get Social Security support, like all sorts of things. How do you get medical care? How do you get birth control? How do you self-manage an abortion? Probably how do you get a divorce? Certainly how do you get HIV treatment? What is safe sex, right? Like they have the whole sex gender thing that they are addressing, and SMA is just part of the picture. And in that way, they have some overlap with some of the doula collectives in the United States who are doing a wide variety of work. They're also, the other place where this strategy is emerging in the United States is and to my knowledge, is in harm reduction. There are needle exchange outreach workers and sex worker outreach networks that are providing information and education and support around SMA, just kind of folded into everything else they do. I was talking with a friend in Florida, and was explaining some of this stuff and talking about accompaniment. And he looked at me and he said, accompaniment, yeah, that's what we do with everybody around all sorts of stuff. And he loved the language and just sort of claimed it for when they're working with people around overdose prevention, when they're helping somebody get housing, when they're helping somebody get into drug treatment, when they're helping somebody get HIV tested and care. He's like, yeah, we accompany people. And that is also some of the roots of the concept in Latin America, is it came out of the many ways that feminists were accompanying vulnerable folks, particularly women and families. And of course, everybody has an internet website. Telehealth and telemedicine are kind of at the outer edges of the medical system, especially telehealth. The rest of this, the hotlines, accompaniment, community health workers, completely demedicalized. So this is a fabulous tree that is in the ethnobotanical garden in Oaxaca, and I thought we could all look at it while I talk about what we can learn from the global South and how all of this work is interconnected. It's certainly more interesting than looking at me or at a blank screen. So what are some things that we can learn from the global South? And first of all, we can hold deep respect for the people who have been doing this work for over 40 years, right? And who have created who have done the work necessary so that we can be like, yeah, SMA, sure. That came out of Latin America, it came out of Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Ecuador. It came out of Indonesia. It came out of multiple sub-Saharan African countries. They figured this out, and then they said, yeah, we'll teach you. Let's just be really clear on the directionality here. So what are some things we can learn? So one thing, I said second trimester in a almost throwaway fashion. So one of the deep lessons that everybody is grappling with is that SMA outside the medical system is possible and has to be possible outside the medical, even in the second trimester. The experts in this are probably Miss Rosie and a combination of Argentina, Chile, and maybe Ecuador. And not everyone will do it because there is a fetus. It is not a clump of cells. But the people who need second trimester self-managed abortions are some of the most vulnerable pregnant people who are turning to activists for help. They're teenagers. They may be people who are multiply marginalized in all kinds of ways. People who have been trying to get a legal abortion and couldn't, and then it's 16 weeks, it's 18 weeks, and what the F are they going to do now? And so they end up with activists who will work with them and who know how to do it safely and carefully. And I don't know the full protocol for that, but let me just give you a quick heads up that they have all told me it involves less misoprostol, not more, and not the same. So just sit with that. And so that's one thing, is that to really do SMA seriously, we need to be willing to do it into the second trimester. We need to have some people who are willing and able to do it into the second trimester, which gets us into the places also every single, according to Farah Diaz-Tejo of If, When, How, every single prosecution of a self-managed abortion in the United States has been at 17 weeks and later. Right? So, and that's not of activists helping people, that's of people who have had an abortion. So it is way more complicated. It's a thing, but it's a thing that can be figured out. It is a thing that people are doing all over the world. So some other stuff. Let me sort of try to pick up the pace a little bit here. So one of the really important lessons from Argentina and Chile both is inside outside. That if we're doing this in our communities, we need contacts inside the medical system, right? The activists who are outside the medical system need to have somebody inside who will work with them, to whom they can send somebody. If somebody is scared, if somebody is afraid, if somebody does begin to hemorrhage, if somebody is like, I really want a sonogram, like I really need to know an ultrasound, I really need to know whether I'm okay and whether this totally worked. Or if somebody is in week 13 or 14 and is having a really hard time, they need somebody they can go to who will not ask questions that don't need to be asked, who will be able to say, okay, you're having a miscarriage. Come right this way. We know how to deal with a miscarriage. Or who can say, you think you had a miscarriage and you want to know whether it was complete? Sure, we can help you with that. And never ask them exactly how the miscarriage took place, not scare them, treat them with respect. And post-abortion care, post-miscarriage care is legal even in places where abortion is illegal. And that's something doctors need to learn. So Argentina has really good inside-outside relationships, to the point where there are doctors who, when abortion was illegal in Argentina, and it may be again under Milei, who would have stacks of flyers from the Socceristas. And when somebody would say, I really don't want this, I'm terrified, what can I do? They would say, okay, I may not be able to help you, but why don't you talk to them? And there were flyers all over some of the waiting rooms. But they also have really good relationships with doctors who will provide medical backup when it's needed for emotional, psychological, or medical reasons. Chile had some really interesting examples also of what you could call referral relationships under really high levels of criminalization. When I was in Chile in 2017, abortion was prohibited under any and all circumstances, including to save the life of the mother. That changed in the fall of 2017, fall for us, spring for them. But when I was there in June and July of 2017, it was still completely prohibited under any circumstances. And I talked with a couple of doctors who were like, yes, of course I have somebody that I send people to. And I even talked to one of those people. One of the doctors connected me with the person she sent people to, who was selling, good pharmaceutical misoprostol that he would get from a variety of places. And, and he would never tell me exactly how he came to do that. But he was actually more isolated and in some ways more vulnerable than the activists. But he would sell on a sliding scale, and he kept people's confidentiality, and he would meet people wherever they needed to be met. So whatever his backstory is, he was doing activist work in his own way. So we need to remember, in places where abortion is illegal, doctors are part of the connection to get people to the support they need, including to SMA collectives and activists, not just to, get in a car and drive for 3 states over. So one of the really important lessons to learn out of global activism is that these are communities of solidarity and communities of knowledge development. Networks. Nobody is doing this work alone. No collective is isolated. Everybody in Latin America is connected to everybody else. Not because there's necessarily an official, formal network. There was at one time a hotline network. It existed for 2 or 3 years, but all the hotlines were connected to each other, and they were helping everybody start new hotlines long before they formed an official network. And there is a red de acompañantes at the moment in Latin America, but the accompaniment collectives were forming and training each other and swapping protocols and figuring out how to adapt each other's protocols and sharing information about complicated cases and how they manage them and teaching each other how to do this long before there was a formal network. You know, it emerged out of long-standing feminist conferences. It emerged out of the fact that people just know each other. Activists know each other. Activists have friends who are activists. And you know, I asked a Chilean how they heard about the, you know, when the hotline launched in Ecuador. How did they hear about that? She said they were super. She was telling me the story of, oh my God, we were super excited to hear about the hotline in Ecuador, and some of us wanted to do it. And so I was like, great, how did you hear about that? Because networks was part of what I was trying to figure out, is how does this information travel? And she was kind of like, somebody got a video attached. Somebody got an email with a video. Who got the email with the video? She couldn't remember. Why that person, who that person knew in Ecuador, lost in the depths of time. You know, I was talking to her almost 10 years later. So, but somebody got a video that, and the Ecuadorians were like, yeah, we shot these great videos and we sent them out to everybody we knew. And then we did a workshop at this regional conference that happens every couple of years. And our workshop was packed and everybody flooded out of there ready to start hotlines, right? So they're making use of the shared spaces that they had to spread information. When I would ask a accompaniment collective, how did you learn about accompaniment? Again, oh, well, somebody knew somebody in Las Libres in Mexico, and everybody knows the socorristas in Argentina, and they sent us their information, and we studied it and figured out how to adapt it, right? So everybody is sharing information, everybody is working together. And when people have a case that, you know, are working with somebody who's in a situation that's unfamiliar to them, they start sending out text messages to other collectives saying, hey, have you had to deal with this? Hey, what do you know about this? So this is just like, it's basic from their perspective. There have been 2 international global hotline meetings, right? Which brought together people from all over Latin America, from Asia, and from sub-Saharan Africa to share information, to share knowledge. And most of what is known about self-managed abortion comes from these collectives and comes from epidemiologists who have worked with the collectives to prioritize the knowledge of the collectives. All right, so let me say a few words about thinking forward to the US before Amelia and I jump into conversation. So it's way different to go from being legal to being illegal than to just go from being illegal to being slightly less illegal. So one of the big differences is that in places where abortion has always been brutally restricted legally, people with uteruses have a lot of taken for granted knowledge. And one of them is, do not be entirely honest with anybody in an emergency service if you have just done something that might be related to a miscarriage. So there's a whole set of taken for granted understandings about who you can trust, who you shouldn't trust, how to manage information that is new for an awful lot of people in the United States. Not everybody, but for an awful lot of people. Lynn Paltrow and I used to joke that it was so much easier working with drug users because they knew that you should never tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth to anybody, anywhere. And that it was much harder to teach that to pregnant women. So doctors are allies, they can be. You know, we need them and they need us. For this to work, there need to be alliances between the inside-outside alliances. And everybody needs to figure out what their fear level is, and doctors need to learn how to respect the knowledge of activists. This is an ongoing project, right? But medical allies are super important. Visibility is useful in some ways, and it can also be dangerous. But a lot of the Latin American collectives told me that they actually felt it was safer to be somewhat visible than to try to be completely clandestine. Because a certain amount of visibility was protective. If they were attacked, it would also be visible. What they were doing was not a secret, and they kept it that way. So criminalization has an enormous history in the United States. We have is one of our many malicious, malignant exports. Going from legal to illegal, the stakes are high. It is intrinsically politicized. Whereas when the Ecuadorian collective launched, nobody gave a shit about abortion law, is what they said to me. Like, nobody cared. It had been mostly illegal for a long time. That didn't change. Nobody really cared. At least not anybody. Prosecutors were not interested in prosecuting abortion. That has changed. As there is a global far right that is very interested in abortion, that has changed in Ecuador. And they said they have to be more careful in 2019 than they were in 2009 or 2008. The majority of the prosecutions are of people who have had abortions. There are very isolated cases of activists. A couple of activists in Argentina recently, Justina in Poland, and there's been a case in Texas. So we're figuring this out. But historically, the people at risk are highly marginalized folks who are having abortions and who come to the attention of the medical system or hostile family members, and somebody calls the police. And part of what we're dealing with here in the United States, which is really different from the places where it has always been restricted or illegal, is that we have a real uncertainty because there isn't a long track record. There isn't decades of trying to figure this stuff out. There isn't a long history of what people will get prosecuted for and what they won't. So we are in a new world and trying to find our way forward. And there are people who are using that to create a regimen of fear. They are trying to terrorize us. And in a lot of ways, one of the hardest things perhaps, and the thing that there's fewer lessons about from south of our borders, is how to thread that needle of what do we actually, where is there legitimate fear and where is there just a protocol of terror. But as the cat is telling us, I believe it's an Ecuadorian cat, but I'm not sure. Es un hermoso día para destruir el patriarcado. It is always a beautiful day to destroy the patriarchy. So, and at the bottom it says it will be law, será ley. All right, so La Revuelta, one of the infamous and adored Argentinian collective. So I thought we'd end with a little homage to La Revuelta. All right.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Yay. The crowd is going wild. That was awesome and exciting. Do you want to unshare your screen so that our heads can be bigger?
I was starting to look at the Q&A. So let me just say briefly, there was a case in Texas where a couple of people were analogous to the situation with Justina. Okay, where a couple of people were being charged with having shared pills with a friend. I do not know where we are with that case, and I would just I refer all legal questions to if, when, how. All right, as far as I'm concerned, they are they're the goddesses of the legal side of it, and the things they don't know, let me say, in the world of networks, there is a network of lawyers that runs from Nova Scotia through the Southern Cone. They know each other, they are in communication with each other, they are sharing legal strategies, they are hashing out cases together. And If When How is part of that network of lawyers, and that includes Caribbean islands. Everybody is in on it, and they are working together because they understand that that we're all in this together. And on the community, let me just say one other thing on the we're all in this together. Like, I really want to recognize that when SB 8 dropped in Texas, and then when Dobbs dropped in June of 2022, the response from Latin America was to say, we will accompany anybody in the United States who needs us. Full stop. We will send you pills. We will accompany you. We will accompany anybody in the Americas. So they are modeling what that kind of embodied solidarity really means.
I think it's not a stretch or a speculation to say that the time between SB 8 going on the books and Dobbs would have been entirely different without Las Libres and other Latin American collectives springing into action in just such an incredible example of just such a generous example of this transnational solidarity, which I think leads me to a first question that I have. So you talk a lot in the book about like how the Latin American organizing has this very strong transnational connection that you said at some point when you were speaking, you were kind of like, it's part of this whole sex and gender stuff that they're doing anyway.
Right.
That abortion is, it's part of like larger struggles against like femicide and, just like female-bodied people, femme people being emancipated to live in their bodies without threat of violence and as full human beings in the workplace and be able to get divorced and all of these things. And it necessarily has led to like a lot of unified struggle with these like different countries facing similar struggles with like probably slightly different stigma and local power structures, but like that solidarity just hits different in Mexico, Central South America than it is currently operating, I would say, in the United States context.
So can I say a couple of things?
Yeah, please.
Related to that. So quick, abortion is super siloed here, right? Like, let me just state the obvious. We know that. It is much less siloed everywhere else. So, right. But what is interesting about particularly the collectives in Latin America is that they are abortion collectives. Right? They have connections to all sorts of other feminist activist organizations and networks and whatnot, but they are abortion collectives, and that is what they do. And it mostly because it takes an extraordinary amount of time. This is labor-intensive activism, and because what they are doing is takes them into some ambiguous zones. None of them have been prosecuted for it, except this one outlier case in Argentina where they think they were actually going after a doctor, and some activists got swept up in it. But the abortion networks are distinct, but they are part of, yes, these larger struggles. Las Libres was doing work around femicide and rape and began to accompany abortions out of that. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's completely integrated, right? Like, the organizations that are running abortion hotlines are also teaching people about HIV. They are also, that's where you really have the community workers who are doing everything, is in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's all it's all about its sexuality and gender, and it's, and why would you even begin to separate them, I think, is the basic attitude. So anyway.
Right. And like, I think that unfortunately the answer in the United States is that the Christian right very like recognize that it would make a very effective political tool to separate abortion in the way that they have, and that like the United States is operating in because of this like wacky experiment called federalism that we're doing. We have like 25 different shitty state level governments, or like outwardly hostile to abortion state level governments, and then like 25 useless ones on them. Like, well, okay, there's some good stuff happening, shield laws, etc. I'm being a total pessimist, but my point is that we have a totally different situation here, not just because of the sort of inherent atomization of like states and the confusion and difficulty with organizing that it causes when like neighboring states have totally different abortion laws, but also because we are like living under state surveillance, a very effective apparatus of state surveillance, high tech, that is being wielded by a very effective, well-organized, conservative legal project that is like 5 decades in the making. And so I think that like one of the things your book does so well is talk about the difference between going from legal to illegal versus what you said was kind of like illegal to like less.
Slightly less illegal, yeah. When they
Yeah.
modify a law slightly, yeah.
Right. So I guess like I just wanted to know if you could talk about what you have learned that you like, what feels like it might be applicable to the United States in terms of this interconnectedness and this sort of geographically flexible solidarity and helping of people when we're under these really specific different state level governments in this fucked up surveillance state that is trying to make us afraid to help each other.
Yep. So, I mean, I think one thing I would say is don't give the state any more power than they actually have. Right? There are regimes of terror that are or attempts to terrorize activists, and not just abortion activists. But we need to be really thoughtful about what actually are the risks we're running. Like people need to really be talking to the lawyers who know their stuff and really trying to figure out what are actual risks here and what aren't. What are we afraid of? What are we afraid of because they make so many bombastic threats, but they actually don't have a leg to stand on? And where do we actually really need to be super careful, right? Because some of that will vary state to state, but not all of it. I mean, I think that a lot of people in the United States don't really believe that or have trouble believing that it is legal to share information. But even in El Salvador, it is legal to share information. El Salvador is one of the most punitive states in the world around abortion. And in El Salvador, it's not legal to have a miscarriage, but it is legal to share information. So we need to really help work to understand what risks there are, how to manage them, who is most at risk in what circumstances. Activists feel super at risk, but there is very, very little track record of prosecuting activists anywhere, including in the United States. Activists are not usually the most vulnerable people in the room, if nothing else because we have a lawyer. Right? Most of us have on tap a fair amount of solidarity. right? And they don't usually go after people who have a lot of solidarity backing them up, right? An activist who is part of a network that can, you know, get people down to the jail if you get arrested, who can be on the phone immediately with somebody at if, when, how, who knows people who are in networks that know how to mobilize are not the most vulnerable people. The
Right.
people who get prosecuted are the people who are alone and terrified and don't know what's going on and are, and are, for the most part, women of color, impoverished, immigrants, and, there is an intense surveillance state, but everything that has been reported, including those two women who were prosecuted or threatened with prosecution for giving pills to a friend in Texas, all of that is because somebody reported them, right?
And
All of the prosecutions begin with an act of reporting. They do not begin with a ghostly surveillance state monitoring what your computer is doing. They may use your internet history after they have a warrant, after you have been reported. All of the fear about, oh my God, if I do a kind of search, they are going to know. There is zero track record of that happening. What happens is that somebody says the wrong thing to somebody says something to the wrong medical person. Somebody's boyfriend reports the situation, or somebody's other family member. You can go through case by case by case by case. People were reported, they were not found.
right. You bring up, you have reminded me of something I've been thinking about today, which it's interesting because your book really focuses on this idea of demedicalization, the idea that abortion in the United States is profoundly over-medicalized, that medical system is already failing a great many people. We know that it is often racist, it is like often insufficient, inaccessible, that those people also are most often the people who are reporting folks who have self-managed abortions, or in the case of Brittany Watts, for example, being denied an abortion, having a miscarriage, going to a hospital, trying to receive care, and then being reported by a doctor who is under the Hippocratic Oath. Wrap your mind around that. Like that miscarriage of justice is so many layers deep. But what I wanted to say, and this is kind of like a weird circle. So SYA has long been really vocal advocates of independent abortion providers. We love abortion providers. We work in like solidarity with clinics all over the country. I have long been on the board of Abortion Care Network, which represents and serves indies all over the country. And I have just become the co-chair of that board, actually, which is an incredible honor. And it's great because we are getting so obsessed with this concept of demedicalization, right? We are like looking to things like your book and to friends that we have all over the country who are really making us know that we can be our own abortion providers. And we have what it takes. And it's my relationships with those independent providers that make me, that have really informed my confidence in us to do that thing. And another thing too is that we really need abortion providers for two super obvious top level reasons to me. The first is care later in pregnancy, right? The second, which, as you said, abortions in the second trimester totally happen. It's a different thing than what you're talking about in your book primarily. People can do it and need to know how to do it. And also it's, not ideal to do it at home with pills, probably most would say. The other reason why I think it's so important that we continue to support and uplift and protect independent providers at all costs is that there are independent abortion providers that still have their doors open in heavily restricted states who are providing miscarriage management to people who have some kind of pregnancy loss, whether it be miscarriage or maybe they took pills, but they need some help. And we need for those people to have a local, independent, community-led abortion clinic. And those are the safe providers, you know, like, so I think it's just an important thing to remember that this is an ecosystem. Indies are a part of that, accompaniment models, hotlines, abortion funds, all of these things, but it's like not a magic bullet situation where it's like, let's all learn how to talk each other through pills and then we'll figure out how to live through this, you know?
I mean, pills should be one option.
Yeah.
Right. But nobody should be, if somebody wants a procedural abortion, they should be able to get a procedural abortion. Right? It's not like we can't, self-managed is incredibly important as an option and as a way to take control under circumstances where control is being made incredibly difficult. It's a pathway to autonomy and self-determination. And, you know, and that's incredibly important. But nobody should feel that that's their only option. If somebody wants a different kind of abortion, they should be able to get that. You know, and yes, it's, and, you know, later abortion care is, and later pregnancy care is incredibly important. And, you know, and the thing we all need to remember is that it's all a miscarriage.
Right.
Right. There aren't abortions and miscarriages. They're all a miscarriage.
And I think that
There
you're
are induced
Mhm.
miscarriages and there are spontaneous miscarriages, but it's all, I mean, granted, a procedural abortion is a different beast, but if we're talking about pills, it's all a miscarriage. And miscarriage management is legal everywhere in the world, including in Texas.
Right. And Naomi is alluding to the fact that people in restricted states who use pills should not ever tell medical, you know, people in hospitals, medical providers, that they took pills. And there's not any reason to, because what is happening medically and to this person's body is like identical to a miscarriage. And there's not a way for a provider to know that a person took pills unless that person took them vaginally, in which case there might be residue. So that is like two important things to remember. If you're in a restricted environment, you should be taking the pills sublingually under the tongue or in your gums, but not to be used vaginally. I have heard repeatedly that taking the pills vaginally reliably leads to less like nausea and cramping. So I think that it might be safe to suggest that to someone who is not in any kind of legal risk. If they're up for that, it seems like people think that it's like a better option. I want to ask you a question from the Q&A from Andy.
I see it.
Yeah.
From Andy. Are there any collectives or organizations that I could share in states who provide crossover services of abortion access, harm reduction, sex education, etc.? So to some extent, the answer to that is that there are some coming together of abortion and harm reduction, but that tends to be in places where it would not be in anybody's best interest for me to give the name of the organization out loud. I think one organization that one organization that can be talked about is HIPS in DC, which is a sex worker advocacy organization. And HIPS is down with self-managed abortion, and I think they are actually part of the GLC. It's a part of a network of folks talking about self-managed abortion at this point. So I think they're part of the GLC. So HIPS is visible and safe. There's also some work that I'm involved in and other people are involved in with the National Harm Reduction Coalition about trying to get information about SMA into their standard health education portfolio. I suspect that there are a fair number of people who are starting to do crossover. I mean, it's somebody I know in North Carolina, where abortion is not completely banned, but is more restricted than we would like, has said that, you know, pretty early on, when restrictions after Dobbs, when restrictions started hitting all kinds of places, that alliances and conversations began to form between some of the reproductive health clinics and some of the harm reduction outreach, sort of on the grounds of, okay, you know, the reproductive health clinics realizing just how marginalized they were becoming, and they better know who else was in that territory. And, you know, so they began to make alliances with groups they would not have previously done. You know, my standard talking point on this one is, you know, go forth and do it. If it sounds like a good idea, then, you know, start talking to folks and start making connections between people in your vicinity.
Yeah, so I guess that leads to a good question that I'm sure you get all the time about this book, which is like, what if people want to start a hotline, an accompaniment collective, an SMA distro collective, or I mean a pill distro collective? What
okay,
do you,
well,
I'm sure that people, yeah.
Pill distro is a whole different world, okay? Because there is no way to make pill distro legal other than by prescription, right? There are pill distro collectives, right? I mean, we know that, but that doesn't mean that it is in that is in a solidly, there isn't some easy way to legalize that. There are people who are taking those risks and who are managing it and who are doing it in ways that doesn't draw too much attention to themselves. And I have huge respect for that. In terms of wanting to start a hotline or an accompaniment collective, I mean, the first thing to do is get yourself and your friends trained. And the easiest low-hanging fruit on training is SAS, self-managed abortion, safe and secure. They do training. Abortionpillinfo.org, and request a trainer, and they will work with you to set up a training. Get your crew trained. They can talk to you about how to run a hotline. There is one hotline in the United States. But I mean, the real things that, the things I would say, if somebody wanted to do it, get yourself trained from SAS. They know what they're doing. They are some of the people who train people all over the world. Get a real heart-to-heart with someone at If When How about where you are, what it is you're thinking of doing, and what legal territory you're on, and what they can tell you about what they know about the details of your particular location and situation. And also talk to digital defense, because activists need to have their digital situation in order, right? It's fine to say that, you know, that people who are having abortions have been reported rather than tracked through their socials or whatever. But activists who are doing this work really need to know how to keep themselves safe digitally. And digital defense fund. So I would say, you know, get your peeps together, talk to those, get yourself through a round of training. And this is how all the Latin American collectives start, right? They get a bunch of people who want to do it, and then they train and train and train and train. And then they launch after they have done all of that. And, you know, I can tell you that hotlines have just one phone, and it needs to be visible and public and known, and it just gets handed around to different people. accompaniment collectives often have a public phone and a private phone. So there's a very visible public phone so that somebody can reach them initially. They get screened, and then whether it's a burner phone that gets trashed every X number of months, or whether it's a long-standing second line, depends on where people are. So because there are more personal relationships with accompaniment, there's a little bit more, there's a 2-layer of protection. The hotline, you just have to make sure not to say anything that's prosecutable.
And I really like how in the book you make a distinction between like activists and anybody who cares about this being really loud about the fact that the thing is possible and happening, and people have options no matter where you live, and abortion pills are available by mail in all 50 states and are safe and effective and used all over the world, all of those things, but being quiet about the actual individual acts of abortion that we are supporting. And that's like so obvious, but I really appreciated the way you laid it out. I feel like, you know, and you kind of spoke to this a second ago, like there's a lot of risk aversion at the institutional and movement level in the United States that I think, unfortunately, is a part of the reason why pills, you know, haven't been more widely known about. It was just clear that like organizations who had lawyers and general counsel advising them were not going to be ever acknowledging the existence of self-managed abortion. And, you know, that's still the case. Like it's probably if you turn on MSNBC and you see a talking head who's like a figurehead of a mainstream repro org on the news, it's unlikely that you will hear them even speak in a way that acknowledges SMA as a potential reality. And in fact, they might speak in a way that implies that the only access that exists is in clinic and if it's legal. And that framing has got to change. And it's folks, activists and advocates, the kinds of people that are listening to this call, all of our voices together can like help elevate the reality that pills are safe and effective and blah, 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 blah. And like shouting that from the rooftops is not, the day that that becomes illegal, you know, we should all be burning down buildings. And we probably should before that. But you know what I'm saying? It's like 2 different levels of communications.
Yes. And we, you know, yes, we need to keep both of those differences in sight at all times. And to think about when the most public voice, what can the most public voice do? Someplace that is nowhere near anybody who is actually having an abortion. Right? Go scream over there while because somebody's doing something over here that should not have a spotlight cast upon it. And yes, and constantly sort of thinking together about how do we use this? How do we use this? You know, and how do we make this work for us?
So speaking of how do we use this, I interviewed another brilliant author the other night, which was Angela Hume, who just wrote a book called Deep Care. The 2 of you are doing some event at the end of this month that you should drop in the chat if you can find it. But this book, Deep Care, is a really wonderful sort of complement to Naomi's book because it's about a collective primarily in Oakland that is a group of women, primarily queer women, doing manual vacuum aspirations in the 70s and 80s. And so it's like Angela's book is like about manual vacuum aspirations in the United States. Naomi's book is about pills all over the world. And these 2 books together give us so much to think about. A thing that I wanted to ask you is how many of the collectives that you were lucky enough to immerse yourself in globally do MVA or like, or were
No,
familiar with that, or is that something that you saw?
nobody does that. Nobody does it because it's a great option.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's also known as menstrual extraction,
Right.
um, particularly when done by feminists.
Mm-hmm.
And you can DIY your own equipment,
Mm-hmm.
which Angela takes, and she's really, I mean, she does a deep dive into a collective that did a lot of extraordinary political work,
Mm-hmm.
and really created clinic defense as we know it,
Yeah.
in addition to doing MVA with folks. But Oh, MVA requires a bare minimum of 2 people.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot do it yourself on yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and it requires some equipment. And it's so if you're talking about outside the system,
Mm-hmm.
DIY outside the system, at this point, pills are just easier.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why nobody does MVA, is because it's like, it's easier to just use pills.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean people shouldn't do MVA, but and there's certainly a reason to learn how to do it, but it requires 2 to 3 people being together in person
Mm-hmm.
in order to do it,
Mm-hmm.
which is very different, and it's also really hard to DIY even at the end of the first trimester.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a reason why it was called menstrual extraction when
Yeah.
it was being done in the community, is that with the kind of setup that you can create yourself from the hardware store, it's really hard to do, and I'm not sure exactly what the crossover point is, but as you get through the first trimester, it gets progressively harder and harder.
Right.
Right, which also makes it less practical because most people are not like, oh, I'm 5.5 weeks pregnant, I'm 6 weeks pregnant, let me go extract this.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are, even if they know it's 6 weeks that they're pregnant, they don't get to the point of being able to do something about it for another 2 or 3 weeks. And at 8 or 9 weeks, you're totally easy with
Right.
pill. You're not totally easy with menstrual extraction at 8 or 9 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So
Um, I want to wrap us up on time.
I'm
I could
hungry.
have a whole conversation. Yeah, you go eat dinner. I could. I think that one of the most interesting things about Angela's book is she deals with sort of this concept of liminality and how we're all used to thinking about pregnancy as this binary and abortion as this totally separate thing than a period or a like
Yeah.
just wanted pregnancy or a miscarriage, and that all of these delineations are ultimately put on us by patriarchal conditioning, and that you don't even have to know that whether or not you're pregnant to
Yep.
end your own pregnancy, maybe,
Yep.
or just get your period. Like there are lots of different ways to look at this and to address this that are outside of the system, like
Yep.
philosophically, in a way that's like quite interesting.
Yes.
Um,
And you hear this, I mean, we call them abortion pills. A lot of people who are doing this work call them abortion pills. But
mhm.
there's an older language that intersects with this about bringing down a period.
Right, right, right.
Right. And there are still people who occasionally strategically will use that language.
Totally.
And I'm teaching a class on reproductive justice at Brooklyn College right now. And we started going through, some of the historical stuff. And, in the late 1800s, abortion wasn't the loss of a pregnancy did not take place until quickening,
Mm-hmm.
right? When the pregnant person feels the fetus move, that it was after quickening that something was an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, was there a pregnancy? Was it lost? How was it lost?
Yeah.
And the beauty of the quickening, the old quickening boundary, is that is about the person who is pregnant is the one who knows when quickening has taken.
Their subjective experience is the
Yeah.
defining one. Yes.
Yes, that is what is central, is when somebody who is pregnant says it's moving.
Right.
Right? That's when you cross over into new territory. Before that, it was,
And
yeah,
and you know what? I think as far as we're both concerned, you still have the right of way, whether it's moving or not.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
probably a great way to close us out. Naomi Braine, you're so brilliant. Thank you for this beautiful book. We hope that
Thanks.
everybody reads it. It's an incredible organizing tool. It will help you understand that not only do we have to figure out how to do this, but we're going to make the world better when we do. And we will hopefully be able to build something that was never actually delivered to us by the false promises of this fucked up capitalist medical system and these horrible laws with huge caveats that exclude poor folks and people of color and so many other people. So let's learn how to take care of each other outside of the system. Naomi Braine, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you to all of you for being interested, and I hope that you find useful things in all of this to take with you to wherever you are and wherever you're going.
We will. We
All
promise.
right.
That's how we will respect your work.
All right. And
Thanks,
your
Naomi.
own
Thank you,
work.
everybody. Yes. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Yes.
Abortion Academy happens the fourth Thursday of each month. Happy leap year, the day that only happens once every 4 years. It's
Happy
like,
Leap Day.
yeah.
And have a good night, everybody.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Talk soon.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.